Hello everyone. Welcome to our first Conservative Party Conference Fringe event. Conservatives Against Racism for Equality has thrown this event in collaboration with British Future. How should Conservatives talk about race? I'm Albie Amankona, one of the co-founders of CARF. Siobhan Aarons is another co-founder who will be speaking later on in this discussion. We started the organisation back in June, and we aim to be Britain's first centre-right organisation dedicated to race relations. We want to create a conservative approach to anti-racism, something which is patriotic, which is common sense, and which is effective. We can't fight racism unless we reach out to all sides of politics, and hopefully we'll build that narrative with all of you today. So I'll pass on to Sunder, who will be chairing this afternoon's discussion.
Thank you very much, Albie. I'm Sunder Katwala, the Director of British Future. It's great to be co-hosting this event with Conservatives Against Racism for Equality. Unlike CARF, British Future is a charity. It's a non-partisan think tank. It's committed to having debates about identity, about race, about immigration, about integration, looking for constructive debates where we try and find a common ground. And it's incredibly important that those debates happen within every political party, within every political tradition. So it's great to be working with Conservatives Against Racism for Equality today as a new organisation that's hoping to sustain this debate on the right. Today's event is called How Should Conservatives Talk About Race? Everybody's talking about race to some extent. There are lots of different voices, and so the debate here is about the centre-right approach. We've had a momentous year in race relations in this country. The COVID pandemic we're all living through certainly has an angle of the ethnic disparities that have been seen. The killing of George Floyd in America sparked protests and debate in the United States, but we then saw Black Lives Matter protests in the United Kingdom as well. So that's been another thing to respond to, and the government has created a race commission to try and take forward the agenda about race. So there's a lot going on to get our teeth into. If we go back over time in this country, race was probably an issue associated more with the left than the right. If we go back to the 1970s Race Relations Acts, the Conservative Party has clearly wanted to contest and change that. The top of the Conservative Party, the cabinet, looks very different in 2020 than it did in 2010. But there are lots of different debates, I think, that hopefully will surface today about what the debate looks and feels like within the right. Different parts of the country, different traditions in the party, different generations might have different views. So we've got a panel today to look at that. We'll hear from Siobhan Aarons, the co-founder with Albie of Conservatives Against Racism for Equality. We'll hear from Andrew Boff, who's got a very long history of campaigning and representation with the London Conservatives. We'll hear from Peter Gibson, who is one of the newly elected class of 2019 in Darlington, one of the MPs who's been changing the geography of the Conservative Party in this Parliament. So different views and different perspectives, but we're all going to have something to say about race. Siobhan, if you could kick us off and tell us how you feel Conservatives should talk about this issue.
Thank you very much, Sunder, for the introduction, and thank you to all of the attendees today. Because if you'd asked me a year ago, even, I don't know, almost 6 months ago, if we would be at Conservative Party conference talking about race, actually it being in the title of a fringe event, I would have said, of course not, don't be stupid, we don't do that. And it's because of this strange year, and as Sunder said, because of all of the things that have happened this year and how the context of the conversation about race was once again brought to the fore and it has changed. It's why Albie and I created this organisation, CARF, and also why we felt that we could talk about this at a party conference, that it did have a place at party conference this year, and that Conservatives across the board deserve to know about and contribute to the anti-racism movement that is sweeping the country. The shifts this year have been so seismic personally as well, because I had spent so long kind of not thinking about racism, sort of, you know, carrying on and just getting on with my life in my individual silo. And it was through being and seeing in particular the young people protesting and the banners that they had as I was kind of walking through Westminster getting my government mandated exercise during the latter halves of lockdown, that it really made me recognize my own story. Because at the end of the day, a person with the name like Siobhan Aarons doesn't normally look like me. That's the presumption, right? And I have seen when people do the double take, because all of a sudden they're like, you're Siobhan Aarons, wait, I spoke to you on the phone and you are not what I was anticipating. Well, what were you anticipating? You know, I mean, that's just stupidness, as we would say in South London. But it kind of reminded me what I had to go through as an individual, how I anticipated after too many times of it happening that this would happen, and I would then just sort of bat it off. And that's not actually okay. And therefore now, as a party and as a person, I am grateful in some ways for this strange time that we've just had, because it actually means that we are now open to recognizing and talking about and accepting that there are times when we are judged and prejudged by our race. Racism is a fact. The stats are there. Discrimination based on your race does happen. And there has been for too long a kind of silence within our party about addressing it, but that seems to have changed. And now is the opportunity for us to not kind of accept that racism is part of the culture wars. You know, that if you're on the left, you talk about it, if you're on the right, that you don't know. This is something that affects all of us in different ways, maybe lesser to you, the individual, but as part of society, it does have an effect. And so now that those MPs who have kind of stood up and have spoken about their experiences have opened a door, and I'm thankful for that door that they have opened for this discussion today. It's an open dialogue that we need. It's not about cancelling people because they've uttered the wrong statement. It's about us as a community of Conservatives. We are the unionist party after all, actually continuing to build that union of people within the United Kingdom. And it's about having trust in each other to have that open dialogue in good faith, to accept that sometimes we may say something in the wrong way, use the wrong phrase, but it's the intent that matters. And then sometimes to pull each other up on our intent as well. And so to actually participate in policies going forward, which reduces the inequalities that there are in our country and in the opportunities of people at all stages of their life. So I look forward to the discussion today that we're going to have, and, you know, kind of go through some of the maybe more awkward things, but to hear our different opinions and to hear yours, the attendees. Thank you, Sunder.
Thanks, Siobhan. A note of optimism about, you know, these challenging and difficult debates. Attendees, welcome to the event as well. There's a chat function, a Q&A function for you to put your questions into, which I will then convey later on to the panelists. You can also talk about what you're hearing out there on Twitter or on social media. Hashtag Let's Talk About Race is the one we're using today. Andrew Boff, I'll bring you in next. I mean, you've been in London politics, London-wide, in the London Assembly since we've had that, not just for the last 10 or 20 years, probably for the last 30 or 40 years. You've seen the politics of race shift a lot. What's that sense has that given you of how Conservatives should talk about race?
Well, thank you so much for emphasising how old I am. I really appreciate that. Yes, I've been in London politics all my life, and now as an Assembly member, I represent the whole of London. I'm a list Assembly member, which means that I represent close to coming on for 9 million people. And the strength of London is the fact that it is the most diverse city on the planet. It is the thing that makes us the engine, not just of the UK economy, but also the international economy. Without London, there would be, you know, I can't imagine where people would go, because there's nowhere like it. And we're like this because we've always been accepting, and we've always tried to treat people on face value and for their for the quality of their character rather than from where they're from. You know, this argument that did spring up as a result of the Black Lives Matters movement was no better articulated in this phrase. And I'm going to read this because I haven't memorized it. In this country and around the world, his dying words, "I can't breathe," have awakened an anger and a widespread and incontrovertible, undeniable feeling of injustice, a feeling that people from Black and ethnic minority groups do face discrimination in education, in employment, and in the application of the criminal law. And we who lead and who govern simply can't ignore those feelings, because in too many cases, I'm afraid, they will be founded on a cold reality. And that's the Prime Minister's words, the head of the Conservative Party, pointing towards what side of this debate we are on. And I don't want to just sort of parrot what Siobhan said in different words, but ultimately I am, because we have allowed the debate about Black Lives Matters. We have allowed our attacks on the extremists who have sought to take over that movement. We've allowed that to be too often seen as an attack on the cause, and it hasn't done us any good whatsoever. We have got to, and often these attacks that take place are from the sharp end of the Conservative Party, because we haven't sent that message clearly enough to our supporters and members of what we are about. And we need to do that. In 2017, we established a code of conduct in the Conservative Party that aimed to deal with all accusations of racism and on wider discrimination as well. And certainly elected representatives were expected to sign up to that code of conduct. We need to review that code of conduct to see how well it's doing. I mean, anecdotally, I think we're doing rather well, but it's only anecdotal. And that's why I've made myself terribly unpopular in some Conservative quarters by saying, yes, I do think that there should be a review of the Conservative Party into, for example, Islamophobia. We need to test whether or not our procedures are working. They seem to be. But the problem from the top is we have been too silent on indicating exactly where we stand on the race issue, because where the leaders speak, the party members will follow. And but for a few statements like the one I read out earlier, there haven't been enough of those. The language that is often used looks like it's picking on them. You know, in London, we are so diverse. We are Black, we are Asian, we are gay, we are straight, we are old, we are young. We are the Conservative Party. We are the sum of our parts. And there is no us and them within the Conservative Party. We are a whole, and we value everything that people bring to this party, from whatever their heritage is, their traditions, and their culture. And if we lose sight of that, then we allow ourselves to become what our opponents are trying to paint us as, which is a party of a very small section of society. And we must never, ever become that. But for that, we need to look at our own procedures and find out, is it working?
Thank you, Andrew. You've set up one of the key themes, I think, for today's Fringe, which is what do the Conservatives want to be a point of consensus that isn't contested in politics, racism, and then where does the right want to contest and argue with the left about what to do about race equality and racism. I think that's one of our key themes that hopefully we'll come back to. Peter Gibson, you are here to speak for yourself, of course, but you're part of this sweeping class of 2019 that many people have said have transformed the Conservative Party, taken it away from London and the big cities and up towards the north as well. How do you talk about race as a Conservative from Darlington?
Thank you, Sunder. It's a pleasure to be here, and I really welcome this event. I think it's addressing a very important issue for how we as a party do talk about this subject. And for me, as an openly gay man, I think that there are a great deal of similarities between the story of gay people in the Conservative Party and the story of people of ethnic origins in the Conservative Party. You just have to look at how diverse our cabinet is now, who have ascended the ranks of the party. And then you look at our party as well. You know, 30 years ago, we were the party of Section 28, and now we have more gay Conservative MPs than any other parliament in the world. And I think that the point that Andrew has made in terms of how the party talks to its rank and file, talks to the country about who it is, what it represents, as a proper meritocracy based on people's abilities, is one that's sort of represented here in London, but I think it's one that the party does sometimes struggle with in the country. And I think party members, rank and file party members, particularly when they are they're living in a community that isn't diverse, where they don't see people from different ethnic origins, become very one-dimensional. And I think we've got to have a very serious conversation about how we tackle that in the party. The code of conduct is essential, and the commission, the race commission, being commissioned to look at that following the events of this year is an important milestone in challenging and tackling some of those issues. I just want to say a few things as a Northern MP elected in one of the so-called now blue wall seats as opposed to red wall. We represent towns that have never or have for a long time not been represented by Conservative MPs, and my own constituency of Darlington is it's a lovely town. It's 96.5% white British, with a small population of every other type of Black and Asian minority ethnic community in there, and we have a content life. Racial differences don't really manifest themselves significantly in our community. But what I see from my role in the Women and Equality Select Committee and the investigations that we've done as a result of COVID, and we've seen the disproportionate impact of COVID on Black and Asian minority ethnic communities, is this, and my take on it is this, that the disparities that we see in our society are disproportionately felt amongst Black and ethnic minority communities because of their socioeconomic status. And they're no different from a socioeconomic point of view than others. But because of the racial element, they have an extra issue to deal with, an extra perhaps intolerance that needs to be tackled in society. And I think as a new member of this parliament, committed to one nation conservatism, levelling up, making all parts of our country, all parts of our communities equal, it's vitally important that we have proper dialogue, proper discussion to ensure that as we move forward and we do level up, that we include everybody. and we include the Black and Asian minority ethnic communities in my constituency of Darlington, and we include those Black, Asian and minority ethnic communities of South London that feel and suffer in those same ways.
Thank you, Peter. So we've got a lot of consensus so far from the different perspectives. We'll see if some of the questions we've got can open that up a bit further. Andrew, can I just pick up something you were talking about to open this up? You're worried that the right is heard critiquing aspects of Black Lives Matter that the right doesn't agree with and isn't heard supporting the cause. What are the criticisms that you would want to make? How can you make those criticisms in a balanced way without falling into that trap?
Well, to not link the Black Lives movement directly with extremism, because that's just not a representation of the truth. The incidents that we've seen in demonstrations, that you see in most demonstrations, is that you get a small number of people who decide, rather than to peacefully demonstrate, they decide to disrupt. And we too often judge that demonstration by the actions of a very, very small number. And I think that's, as a party, we've got to be sophisticated enough. And I think at a certain level we are, but this needs to happen at a lower level. We should be sophisticated enough not to just say, oh, well, they all must be like that then. Because that's the problem that we have is at the sharp end. We hear the criticism that Black Lives Matter is in some ways an underground movement for the overthrow of the monarchy, capitalism, and all the rest of it. That's not the consensus view of people who support the principles of Black Lives Matter, which is and those principles merely being that Black citizens should receive the same treatment as everyone else. It's a very, very simple objective. And we should seize on that.
Thanks, Andrew. Siobhan, what's your experience been of the debate inside the party with fellow party members in terms of, this particular articulation of anti-racism? There must be quite a lot of Conservatives saying for anti-racism, but this version seems to be dividing people, not uniting them.
Actually, I disagree with you in terms of once you start having a conversation with party members. Now, of course, I don't know party members from all across the country, only those who I talk to, and I'm always happy to have a discussion with anyone. But what is clear is because so many of us, as part of either we support the levelling up agenda, we're One Nation type Conservatives, we see the union not just in terms of the union of the 4 countries of the United Kingdom, but also the union of us as citizens together of the United Kingdom. Once you actually get rid of the presumptions, like, for example, as Andrew highlighted with, Black Lives Matter and what that means, and you actually start getting down to the nitty-gritty of what is it that we all want. We want a fair and equitable society, and sometimes that means we need to be proactive in achieving that. Then you find that there's a lot more consensus. The thing that I think is crucial for us as Conservatives, especially here and now, is to not get sidetracked, is to not be drawn into some of the other debate, which is then when we highlight and magnify the actions or the speeches of the few and actually focus on those core things. Because ultimately we want a United Kingdom that is going to be the best for us. We are already fortunate. The UK is by far one of the best places to be a minority ethnic, don't get me wrong, but that's not enough. We have to keep working together. And I think, again, going back to that point I made earlier about not, taking on the left in the way the left does, not cancelling people, not, being aggressive, but actually like looking for the consensus together. That's how we do that. You said, Sunder, that earlier, I was so positive. I have to be positive. I'm not going to be drawn into the mire of the negativity. We know where the issues are. We've had the commissions, they've written up their reports. It's now about positively working as Conservatives to change the agenda, to keep pushing forward, to keep growing the United Kingdom.
Thanks. I also want to ask you all about the idea of a culture war. We're not having a very culture war type conversation today, but we hear more and more about the culture war. It's quite interesting, actually. The evidence of this shows that the British media talks about it every time the Americans are having a presidential election, but it's really gone off the scales since Donald Trump was elected. And Peter, one of the thoughts there is that people have tended to put Brexit with Trump and say there's a new politics of identity. Did you go to university or not? Are you younger? Are you a minority versus are you on the other side of all of this? How does the Conservative Party, that is obviously, you know, the party of Brexit and delivering it, how does it get out of that idea that this is bringing Donald Trump's kind of politics or divisions to Britain?
Well, if I can just go back to the previous point, Sunder, I think the difficulty that a lot of Conservatives have with regards to their reaction to the demonstrations that we saw over the summer in respect of Black Lives Matters. For the vast majority of Conservatives, they are law-abiding citizens who abide by the rule of law and respect their history and their heritage and the culture that brings together our United Kingdom. And when they see citizens breaking the law and damaging cultural icons, despite them perhaps having valid concerns and valid issues that they wish to raise, and the cause of racism and ensuring equality in society, that there is that conflict between, as Andrew has alluded to, respecting the issue and the cause with that conflict that they see. You are not going to see the vast majority of Conservative supporters celebrating any statue being pulled down, anybody breaking social distancing rules, anybody having those events that jar with their values. And I think in order for us as a party to have a sensible adult debate about race issues, we need to understand and respect the cause that we're talking about without being aligned with that cultural vandalism, that destruction of icons, that breaking of the rules and the law in terms of social distancing and getting together. Unfortunately, the whole Brexit debate and aligning us with Trump, I think, is a disappointing one, and I think it dumbs down the complexity of the Europe debate to a level that I think is behind us now. We need to move on. That's a done and dusted piece of business, and I don't think there's anything to be gained in the media aligning Brexit supporting people with Trump's agenda.
Thanks. Andrew, what's your take on this sort of idea, cultural? I mean, there's also a critique of identity politics here that probably a lot of people on the right worry about getting identity politics wrong.
I think we've got to educate ourselves and realise that one of the things you should never do as a politician is to criticise the media, because it's like criticising the rain. It's always going to come, you know. But there is something about educating our own members about how to see that media. For example, the coverage, for example, of that atrocious vandalism against monuments that are deeply important to a large number of people, if not everyone in the United Kingdom virtually. They spend their time on that, right? A lot of percentage of their time reporting those, rather than 99% of their time reporting the peaceful protests. But I'm not going to change the media. They will always report the most sensational. They will always report the most atrocious. But our members need to understand that is the proportions. We need to We need to, time and time again, when these things happen, and they will, because extremists do what they do in order to gain attention to their cause and to create that kind of conflict and debate. They do it deliberately, and I'm not being Machiavellian here. They absolutely do it deliberately, so they can create that debate to divide people. We must do more about education. And Peter so rightly said, but we're in a far better place than where we were 20 years ago in terms of Conservative Party. We are now more diverse than we've ever been. And we've got to keep that going. And when we're sitting in our executive committees at our local ward, branch or constituency, and we look around the table, we realize that, okay, all good Conservatives here, but does it look like the constituency or the ward that we aim to represent? That's what we should be doing instinctively. I mean, we do it with regard to the age issue. We look around the executives of most Conservatives association with the average age well over mine, which is considerable. And we say, alarm bells, we must get more young people on board. We should be doing the same when it comes to representing the differences in our constituencies. And just to give you an example of this, my home constituency is, my home association is Barking. And we were sitting down just before the last local elections and compiling our lists of candidates, as you do. I don't know if anybody has seen the film Blazing Saddles, but to paraphrase Blazing Saddles, we looked round there and we said, we looked at the list and we looked at the people around us and we said, where are all the white people? Because in Barking, we have to actively encourage the applications from white people, white English people in this constituency. And it's the nature of the, and so we did. We actively went out and looked for white English people to join. This is what every association should be doing, not in some tokenistic way. I'm not talking about quotas. I'm just saying, are we comfortable in ourselves that this party represents everybody here? And inclusiveness is not a destination. It's a cultural change. You'll never get there. You'll never get to the situation where you look exactly like the people you represent. But it must be in our DNA that we continually try.
Thanks, Andrew. Siobhan, I'd like to hear from you on this question about history. I mean, Peter and Andrew have said people have a lot of pride in history in this country and statues and so on. So worried about proposals to take down statues. Clearly, when it comes to war memorials, they reflect the contribution that people from every ethnic background made from across the Commonwealth. So that, that extreme of the process perhaps should know some history. But there's a desire to critically interrogate the history of empire and what it meant from this country. How do you feel can Conservatives get into that discussion?
Conservatives are the best to get into that discussion. Because, it's like in our core DNA, the past to how it's created who we are today is an important part of who we are and what we represent. And the past is always being seen through the lenses of the present, right? And so therefore, Conservatives today, present tense, should be also part of the discussion of looking back on the past. That's not to say we're not talking about eliminating it, because it's there. It's making us who we are. It's given us the foundations. Let's go straight into it, right? With Bristol. Now, there is no Bristol without a certain event that happened for a very long time. And that legacy, both positive and negative, but remember there is positive too, is there today. So to turn around and just to try to completely, dare I use the phrase, whitewash what happened in the past, it's not okay. That's why Conservatives need to be there to look at it critically, to be able to demonstrate and show and own all of it together. And so if we are then going to have a discussion prior to a statue being pulled down is what is the best thing to do, is to look at that person, what they represent, what it says about the area, etc., in a 360 way. And therefore then make decisions about what is right for both the present and the past, and to find a way for those to join. And the Conservatives are by far the best to do that, because we're not starting from a position of trying to be whatever the latest hip woke or whatever the newest word for that is at all. We're actually looking for, how do we as a country, as individuals, as communities, draw together to actually go forward. And that's why it's not just about kind of, you know, looking like the immediate area that we are in, that we represent as Conservatives, but also being allies for those who aren't at our table at that time. You know, and because take Darlington, they have the very small, as you said, Peter, you know, have a small minority ethnic population. But nonetheless, within Darlington, you know, there are allies who are saying critically, oh, you know, how have we approached X? What's, you know, our opinion on Y? And is that actually one that is promoting equality and ensuring, you know, that discrimination is reduced and eliminated?
Thanks. Let me bring in some of the questions we're being asked from our audience. This one's from Salman Anwar, who's a Conservative member. His question is, how does the Conservative Party understand Islamophobia? From my experience, I feel they've failed to understand it properly, which feels to a failure to deal with it properly. He then says that last conference he went to, a fringe event on Islamophobia called Challenging Islamophobia, but this didn't address the elephant in the room. Instead, it focused on Islamists and those that weaponize Islamophobia. This is the first time I felt properly uncomfortable as a Muslim, as most Muslims did in the room, at my own party conference. So let me take that back to the broad, some specific experience and question, but the broader question of anti-Muslim prejudice and the Conservative Party. Peter, what's your sense of where the party is on this issue?
Well, I think if a member of the Muslim community has attended our conference and has attended event and felt uncomfortable and unhappy, then he should have reported that at the time. There is no place in our party for that. That's not to say that it hasn't manifested itself and it hasn't been there, but having got that code of conduct in place, there are channels for that to be challenged and investigated and rooted out, and rightly so. I have got Muslim friends in the Conservative Party. I am not aware of Islamophobia that they've experienced, but I know that they are certainly vocal enough that if they did experience and witness it, they would come forward and shout up. And I think anybody that does experience any form of discrimination, be it Islamophobia, any type of racism, homophobia, misogyny that they experience in the party, then use of the code of conduct is there to root that out, and that's what they should do.
Thanks, Peter. Andrew, I suppose part of the question here is that, you know, certain types of racism, lots of people feel very confident about spotting. The boundary here between a robust debate about integration and prejudice and stereotypes, are people confident about this boundary?
I don't quite know what you mean by that. What do you mean confident?
I mean that, you know, people need to talk about issues of integration or, you know, segregation in schools and so on. They might be then making comments about, you know, people from different backgrounds. Obviously, we need to have those debates, but we need to not be stereotyping, you know, a group. Is the Conservative Party more confident about racism of an overt skin colour kind than where those particular issues lie?
I was looking forward to this moment when I'm going to disagree with Peter Gibson, because I didn't want to agree all the time. I think there is Islamophobia in the Conservative Party, and it's subtle. But if you look, for example, at what the definition of anti-Semitism is, one of the definitions of anti-Semitism is that you do not attribute to a Jewish person in the party the conduct of the war or the troubles in Palestine. You can't hold that person responsible because of their ethnicity. But from my personal experience, I've heard people hold Muslims responsible for some of the terrorist outrages that have taken place. It's you see it often on Facebook and Twitter and all the rest of it, and sometimes from conservatives, as though these Muslims should have spoken out more about this thing. It's simply not right that you judge individuals on the basis of the last piece of bad news that you heard. And even though we are, what I don't want to paint a picture of is that the Conservative Party is unwelcoming. It is a very welcoming environment, and most people from ethnic minorities who've joined the Conservative Party that I know report a very content experience, are comfortable here. But that shouldn't make us complacent we shouldn't be complacent about not recognizing when that does happen. And I will go back to agreeing with Peter, of course, because we should have, those members should have the confidence that they'll be able to speak up. The last chairman of Barking Association was a hijab wearing Muslim, and I constantly asked her, I said, do you feel welcome? She's all over the place. She's been a parliamentary candidate. She's well embedded in the Conservative Party. And I constantly ask her whether or not this is a welcoming environment for her. She's not that kind of person who wouldn't speak up if she thought there was a problem, quite frankly. Frightening, really. But she is not the kind of person that would just sit back and take it. But for Salman, I'd just say to you, there is that code of conduct, there is that complaints procedure. We need to use these procedures. They're not just window dressing, they are actually a part of what it is to be a Conservative. And I urge you, when you see that happening, that you do report it. It's very difficult to gatekeep on the kind of people who are joining the Conservative Party. You know how people can be. But the test of the Conservative Party is how we react when we get a complaint, when we see that there's a problem. As I say, anecdotally, I think we do quite well, but we need more feedback from party members. Sorry, that was a bit of a treatise, but
thanks.
You know,
thanks, Andrew. Siobhan, what's your sense of this being an issue that Conservatives are looking at and working out what they can do about?
And I think, you know, as both Peter and Andrew talked about, we have the code of conduct. I'm aware anecdotally that you know, people have made their feelings known to CCHQ, to the main body of the Conservative Party, and also that it has and is being looked at. I think that, as is always true with any organisation, you've got what the, let's call it, senior levels, the framework the organisation may be doing, but also as, you know, activists, volunteers, local party members et al., that can be different. And I think one of the things that we are looking at as CARF going forward is actually how we can be part of the education and awareness raising at the grassroots level, you know, to be able to be a constructive voice on, you know, helping the activists and the local parties, actually the local associations rather, actually being better at being able to spot and tackling these things at the local level, so that across the piece of the party and all the different bits that make up the framework of it, we're actually tackling these things and people feel confident to be able to come forward and that issues can be resolved in the best possible way. Thanks,
Siobhan. I think this point about education is quite important and is perhaps where the party needs to go beyond the access to the code of conduct, because there's a broader cultural change. I thought Andrew hit it very well there in the analogy of holding Jewish people responsible for Israel. People might not realise until you talk to people about why that isn't appropriate, that it isn't appropriate. So it's these broad group stereotypes. I mean, some research produced just last week showed that, you know, a lot of Conservatives doubt there's a problem of anti-Muslim prejudice in the party, but a very large portion of party members think there are no-go areas for non-Muslims in our cities. So establishing what that's about and why that might cross the line seems quite important. So maybe more education is quite important here. Let's take another question. Benita Meta Palmer asked one of the questions we were hoping to get into today.
Sunder, can I just come back?
Peter.
Can I just
Yes,
come back
please
on
do.
the education
Yeah.
point? I think the education point is a really, really important point, particularly when we're talking about the age demographic of our party around the country, and Andrew's mentioned it earlier, in terms of the age profile of some of our associations is of a generation where language may be different to what is acceptable today. And if you have an association with an elderly management structure in place, and you're in a part of the country that is not very diverse, and you have very few, if no, association members from ethnic minorities, understanding and knowing what is right and what is acceptable to say, and how to communicate about those issues that you're not tackling and dealing with on a day-to-day basis, and you're not engaging with people from those communities, it is something that I really do think that not only in the party, but certainly in society, wider society, there is more education needs to be done.
Thanks, Peter. So the next question I wanted to put to you all is from Benita Meta Palmer. Is the term BAME problematic? And maybe the harder bit, what should we use instead? Siobhan, I think I should go to you first.
Oh, thank you for getting me to answer the very difficult question. Is BAME problematic? Yes, you're damn right it is problematic, because that is one lazy ass piece of I don't know what from policymakers. Because it's lumping together all different types of people, different types of experience, different cultures, different ethnicities, different religions, but it's a one nice homogenous group. Well, it's not. And what it does then is make it very easy in some ways for policymakers to come forward with their solutions to things, and to also be able to quantify how well their solutions have done without actually really breaking it down. Different backgrounds, different socioeconomic groups, different places you live, educational experiences are all this one BAME. Now, Sunder and we will both be BAME. No offense to Sunder, but I think we're very different. You know, and that's true. And so what should be done? I'd say, especially as a Conservative, I will probably start from a position to say, let's just bin the whole thing, right? And actually, as I think Peter also alluded to, when we're looking at where disparity and discrimination is, we may find that actually it's more about, for example, limited access to healthcare. Now, is that because of geography? For example, the same thing with, you know, educational attainment. When we actually look at it, is it because of socioeconomic backgrounds in a wider context? And so actually by tackling those issues that as Conservatives we really believe are important in order to level up our One Nation agenda, then actually we should be focusing on the groupings that people fall into, which we will find most of the time is not because of our ethnicity. So BAME, bin it.
Bin it. I'm not sure what's coming instead, but that's gone. Andrew, anything to add to that?
You should try being a member of the LGBTQI plus community, and then you'll have something to complain about. No, whatever people feel is appropriate for them. The trouble is, every suggestion that will be made, somebody is going to horrendously dislike. This is a compromise that's unresolvable. I've always thought the term wider heritage, I don't know, something that could be, that could unite people, but I suggest this is a fool's errand to come up with a title that adequately represents everyone who feels wanting to be included, but not with that title. I mean, BAME, does it include Polish people? I don't know. Does it? Because Polish people are, you know, and people from East Europe are experiencing some of the same issues that Black and ethnic minority people are experiencing, but we're not including them in that under that umbrella. So this is a very, very difficult task. It's not one everybody's going to agree with.
Peter, maybe you have the solution.
I haven't got the solution. I concur with the problem. It's a very useful shorthand for policymakers. It's an easy shortcut, but I know from the evidence that we've taken in umpteen sessions at the Women and Equalities Committee and the impact of COVID on various aspects of the BAME community, it's not a uniform, homogenous group. It's made up of people from different parts of the world, different ethnicities, different religions, different cultures, and the impact of any policy affects members of that community in different ways, depending on their socioeconomic background, their upbringing, their education, where in the country they live, etc., etc., etc. I think, again, I agree with Andrew that we're going to end up in a problem trying to come up with a new word, a new solution that catches all. That's not what is not covered by the majority. And so whilst it's uncomfortable, it's not perfect, it's not great, it does the job for now until somebody else comes up with a better solution. I don't know how best to describe people who are not white and not British and not Christian and not from here, who live here, are born here, etc. It's really complex, and you risk offending somebody and excluding somebody and trying to include everybody. So it's probably best to not even try. And
exactly.
I know that's
and that's the point I'm making in terms of, and this is personal opinion, right? You spend so long trying to find the catch-all term for the, as Peter said, the not. And actually then that just basically means a whole load of people. But what we've done now is exclude that first group that it kind of went to the not about.
Yeah.
That is not conservative.
No.
That's my heart's
not achieving. That's not achieving it. And so that's why I'm just like, let's change the focus and let's actually like deal with the issues, deal with disparity, with racism, with homophobia, you know, in a positive, inclusive way, and not get sidetracked by this.
My heart is with Siobhan on this question, but I do think we overcomplicate what we're trying to do here. So at the level of identity, we're never going to hold a meeting and then 8 million people are going to agree on this, umbrella term. I mean, I'm the Indian Irish Catholic lapsed Essex Scouse mixed race sort of part of the conversation. My people never get a proper voice, you know, when we have these debates. So identity, you decide for yourself. I might go for British. That's pretty British. You're Indian Irish, lapsed Catholic, etc., and so on. And different people do it in different ways. But the thing that is pragmatically useful are the statistics. And it's useful to have the overall statistics, and it's useful to have the broken down statistics. I think the baby with the bathwater question is, let's collect the data to look at class and ethnicity and gender and place properly. And they don't do that in France. As an ideological position, it's incredibly un-French to collect the data. So they simply don't know if there are COVID ethnic disparities. So I think if we establish that there's going to be race audits, that, you know, there's a category at the top, which is the ethnic minorities, but that we talk about ourselves as ourselves. Mixed race people actually went from being other, I think, in the 1991 census to being mixed race, but you still can't be Asian Irish in the categories because there are too many boxes. So let's
just back what you're saying, Sunder, is I had quite a struggle along with other assembly members to try and include Latin American people in as a measured minority who are very significant in terms of the economy of London and have some real challenges. They've got the least unemployment rate of almost any minority, of any ethnic group, and yet there's some real extreme poverty there, but they weren't being measured. And unfortunately, it's a fact of government that if you're not measuring something, you can't attend to the issues that those people have. So BAME, Peter's so right. I hate agreeing with Peter. He's absolutely right. This is an administration thing. This is how government is able to organize itself. Well, I'm looking forward to that definition of mixed race, Catholic, and all the rest of it under that.
Yeah, so but you've hit on it there, the baby in the bathwater point. Measure everything, but don't label. Don't give everybody a label. Now, several people are asking us about the electoral politics of ethnic diversity in our country, and I think it's important we get onto that. The Conservatives much more diverse at the top table than you were 9 or 10 years ago, and your vote is pretty much where it was, as far as we can tell. 1 in 5 ethnic minority people, whatever this label is overall, different levels with different groups. You're half as likely to vote Conservative if you're not white than if you're white. What's going on? What would change that? Andrew, you must have thought a lot about this, trying to win elections in London. What do you think the key is here?
In one of the other things I do, I'm chair of an organisation called Africa House London, which is an organisation for using the energy of London's diverse African communities to improve trade with sub-Saharan Africa. And in that time, over the past many years, I've met a lot of Nigerians. Do you know, I've never met a socialist one. I have never met I'm sure they exist somewhere, but I've never met one. And yet, if you ask those Nigerians how they vote 80% for the Labour Party, a party that is directly against their fundamental principles about family, hard work, independence, and all the rest of it. So it's a real problem that we have within the Conservative Party. We're solving part of it by the fact, as you point out, Sunder, that we've got a much more diverse cabinet. We've got a much more diverse Houses of Parliament. I think the progress is being made, but in all things, there is a policy lag. For example, we know that the unemployment rate amongst Black people, if I can use that term, amongst Black people is higher than for white people, using very, very broad brush classifications there. But actually, year on year, it's getting better. There is a policy lag that means things that you put into place now may not see realization till some years down the line. And just anecdotally, the Conservative Party, certainly in London, is becoming much more diverse, and more people seem to want to join the Conservative Party and realize it reflects their personal views. So this is not a point of despair, but it is, as I said beforehand, the Conservative Party needs to change its culture rather than just treating the destination. The destination could be, we have so many % government ministers who are from minority backgrounds. That's a destination, but it doesn't actually change the culture. The culture needs to be changed at the sharp end. And I think it's working. And that's the optimistic thing about it. I do think it's working, but it's early days.
Siobhan, love your view on this. The Conservatives aren't doing well with young people generally compared to a little while ago as well. Is that a linked issue to this challenge of the votes?
Yeah, I think so. And again, that's just a fact. I think, as I was told earlier today by Albie, the mixed race group is ever growing. In fact, potentially will soon be the largest ethnic group, if that's the right term for it. All of that is very confusing. I personally went through a long stage in terms of the box ticking exercise of having to do Black other, because it was only Black African or Black Caribbean, and I was like, I'm half Guyanese, half Jamaican, and so it didn't quite fit in any box, and I was like, and I will make a personal point about it, and so that also helped shape some of my political views, because I grew up in the Blairite era of all of that, and I was quite opposed to that being put in a box, and in particular the other box. I did not like being deemed an other, and so that's kind of shaped my politics, whereas of course the young people now have gone through both the recession and then right at this moment, you know, the impacts of COVID and lockdowns, etc. And that definitely does shape them, and that's whilst we have been in government. And maybe we have been slow in the past in terms of communicating well, you know, our position as Conservatives, as tolerant, equitable, fair people. And our policies have maybe failed to reflect that, and so or to seem to reflect that, because ultimately perception is kind of key and bigger than almost what you're doing. It's how it's viewed, and that lens is something that we are still needing to work at as a party.
And Peter, I've definitely heard people say, you know, this is more difficult than we thought, even having a very diverse cabinet hasn't helped, but oh well. Don't need to energise so much on that now, because we can win the blue wall instead.
Well, I think this is really interesting, and it mirrors to a large extent what we've done in the north in turning those formerly red seats blue, because what we've done is we've actually gone out and had conversations about what we stand for as a party and the values that we represent with long-standing Labour voters who we may not have talked to before. And when they talk to us and we listen to them and they listen to us, they understand that the values that they represent are actually the values that we have always represented. And I think once you go and have those conversations with communities that we've not necessarily automatically had representation from, and you start talking to them about what British values are, what Conservative values are, they mirror very similarly a lot of the values that they stand for themselves. And I think by continuing to have those conversations, that's how you start to change that perception about where our votes come from. It isn't going to happen because we've got Asian and Black cabinet members. It's not going to happen like that. It's about that engagement in a community on the ground, and as Andrew has talked about, making sure that the representatives that you get elected in a community represent that community, so that the community representatives accurately reflect or are drawn from all elements of that community. That's how we take it forward. It's not going to happen overnight, and it's going to take a long time to do. But if we continue to have those conversations, we continue to go into those areas that we might perhaps have considered no-go areas, where we have perhaps assumed people's voting intentions, and we actually go out and have those conversations, talk about our values, talk about British values, talk about Conservative values. That's how we bring people to us.
Thanks, Peter. I'm sure the focus on relationships and contact and time is right. I think it's really important the Conservative Party diversified, you know, who its people are, and that's a really important foundation. But maybe in the Cameron era, there was a kind of simplistic view that sort of Asian people would vote for sort of Asian politicians. I mean, it's a good job we don't vote our skin colour, I think. Now, the audience want to shake this up a bit. Let me tell you some of the things they're asking from different perspectives. So Adrian Hart has got a critical question here. He's not convinced the panel understands what BLM's principles really are. And he asks, what is Andrew Boff's view on critical race theory and concepts like white privilege? And I don't think that needs to be only Andrew who gets asked the question, critical race theory and white privilege. But a similar question from a perhaps different perspective, Nicholas Hatton says to Andrew and Peter specifically, in the light of BLM, in making a strong statement of race relations, would you recognise your white privilege? Or is that a step too far in the race debate? So I think we've got a critical and a positive question about white privilege. And Georgina Lewis throws in another word for this debate. Does the panel think the term or idea of intersectionality is a useful one. Does this have any useful role in the education piece mentioned before? So Andrew, in about 60 seconds, if you could do intersectionality, critical race theory and white privilege, I'd be very impressed.
I think I'm lost with critical race theory, to be honest. It's a very complex area. But I think in terms of white privilege, of course it exists. Best summed up, may I say, in a video done a couple of months ago by John Amici, which explains that white privilege is not, the acceptance of white privilege is not a threat to white people. It's just understanding that Black people are judged on the basis of their ethnicity where white people are not. I used to live in Shoreditch, and at the top of the Shoreditch High Street, there was a place where the police always used to stop motorists and check them out. And they did it very, very frequently. I'm surprised people didn't recognize that this is what they do. They used to stop the cars at the top of Shoreditch High Street. And I remember going past so many times, and as I saw the police car with another car stopped, I said to myself, please don't let them be Black. Please don't let them be Black. Please don't let them be Black. They were always Black. Always. And you've got to understand that people don't get stopped because they're white, but they can get stopped because they're Black. And unless we recognize that, we're just paying lip service to the problems that we have with regard to race.
Thanks. Siobhan, would you talk about white privilege? Should Conservatives talk about white privilege?
Why is there anything which is a no-go and we shouldn't talk about it? I'm sorry, I'm not an academic on any of these things. I'm a person who lives in the world, who wants our world to continue to be better, in particular in the UK. And therefore that means that we have to talk about it. And sometimes then we end up disagreeing with what it is, right? But white privilege, I think, is really important to talk about. I can only agree with what Andrew said about that. And I always use the example of, you have two working class, we'll pick girls, so Dean's exactly the same, you know, started off in the local primary school, went through the education process, went to a Russell group, you know, applied for that first job and turned up to an interview. And the reality is, too many times, they will be treated differently because of the color of their skin. They will be seen differently because of the color of their skin. Now, that's not to say that, you know, in terms of educational opportunities, that there was necessarily any difference between those two girls when they started out. No, because they had exactly the same kind of environmental upbringing, if you see what I mean. But you then get to a certain stage where it's immaterial where you're from as a white person, but it is still material that you are Black, because that is how you are judged, or that you are wearing a hijab, for example, or any of those things. And that's the white privilege that has growingly been acknowledged, even with, especially within our party. I just saw what Steve Baker had to say the other day, and I really thank him for that. And I welcome, you know, what he had to say. And that is the conversation to be having, so that we as a party, as individuals, don't kind of misunderstand or presume it's this thing and it's an adversarial. It's not about that. It's just that sometimes some of us have certain privileges which we didn't have to work for. And regardless of what type they are, it's part of the owning who we are as individuals that we also need to be cognizant of when we are decision makers.
Peter, does 97% of Darlington have white privilege?
Well, this is a really interesting discussion, and echoing what Siobhan said, I think Steve Baker made an eloquent and helpful contribution to the debate the other day in respect of that. This is a phrase that until very recently I'd never heard of. Growing up in the northeast of England as a working class kid who was a gay a gay Tory who was Roman Catholic, I certainly didn't feel as though I had a white privilege in life. But obviously, there are people who believe that because I am white and because of the stories that we've heard about how people are mistreated or prejudged because of the colour of their skin, there is obviously a white privilege there. But I think you start to have that conversation with white working class boys, for example, from an underprivileged part of town, and you start talking about their white privilege to them. And this comes back to the point that I made at the very beginning, that a lot of the disparities that we face and we see in society are a result of socioeconomic and educational background, social mobility, etc. You can overlay race over that in order to explain some of those issues, but it doesn't get to the fundamentals that we still have an unequal society, and we need to continue to work to level up to make this a one nation country where people's opportunity is based on their ability to go as far as they possibly can. Just to follow up on the second point about intersectionality, we had the conversation about BAME as a terminology. You then start bringing intersectionality into it, and then you start cross-sectioning that with the LGBT community. Oh my goodness, it makes it even more complex, hugely complex.
And that is one of the challenges, I think, that we're talking about issues that people care about. But if we talk about them in terms that they don't understand, it's going to be difficult. I tend to think Peter's point is a rather good one, that white privilege is a thing, but this might not be the most constructive or useful way to describe that thing, because talking about privilege might make people say, well, I'm not privileged. Whether you can find common ground on that agenda of equal opportunity, the barriers of white working class disadvantage, black disadvantage being part of the same agenda seems to me key. We're almost out of time. Just like to give you all one last thought or comment on the discussion. How can this discussion stay around? A lot of people have said, is the Black Lives Matter, the anti-racism protest, is it a movement? Is it a moment? Will it be a flashpoint? We've had flashpoints before. Will it be sustained? How should we take these debates forward? Maybe I'll start with you, Peter.
Well, I think the debate starts here. I thank CARF for the efforts that they've made already in trying to raise this issue on the agenda and making it a conservative held part of the debate. Getting people to sign up to their pledge is an important part of that. Education throughout the Conservative Party is another continuing part of that. And we start to address it through policy with our majority government, levelling up, one nation conservatism, we can really start to address these issues, and it's part of an ongoing debate that we need to ensure that they remain centre stage, and I'm sure that CARF will continue to do that.
Andrew, how would you sustain the focus on this issue in the party?
Peter summed it up well. If I lived in Darlington, I might even vote for him, but he's done it very well. Actually, I think Siobhan about summed it up very early on in this meeting. We've just got to keep talking about it. We've just got to be brave enough to talk about race and prepare ourselves for what we know are going to be the attacks, because some people will treat us like some kind of leftist entryist into the Conservative Party if we happen to talk about racial disparities in unemployment, if we happen to talk about stop and search rates among young people. We have to talk about it and then disabuse people that our solution is to end capitalism, destroy the family, and pull down every single statue. That's not our solution. Those aren't our solutions. But just identifying the problem and having the confidence to talk about it. And actually, I've just done that quite recently. We've had a little bit of a debate. I shouldn't tell you what happens in group meetings on the GLA. We're just having a conversation about courses for Metropolitan Police on unconscious bias. And we should be taking the lead on those areas, not trying to portray courses on unconscious bias as some kind of brainwashing. It's about having conversations about race, about knowing what our own prejudices are. We are all prejudiced. and keeping the conversation going.
Siobhan, the last word to you.
I can do nothing more than to agree with both gentlemen, and also to plug one more time our organisation, Conservatives Against Racism for Equality, CAF.org. Also find us on Twitter, and we will keep this conversation going, and with the support of the attendees and anyone else you know within the Conservative Party, we also want to educate and to promote and amplify this as an issue.
Well, thanks to all of our panelists. Do tell us what you thought about what you heard. # Let's Talk About Race. Do get involved with Conservatives Against Racism for Equality. Do keep in touch with British Future. This needs to be a debate that goes on and goes on in an increasingly diverse society. I think we made a good start today. Thanks everybody much for coming to Fringe, and thanks to our speakers. Thank you.